Hey guys, welcome to the Ben Tracy podcast, where I interview thought leaders, parents, and educators about navigating life in the digital age and what we can all do to keep kids safe online. This podcast is sponsored by Bark Technologies. Let's get into it. What's up, guys? Welcome to episode 3 of the Ben Tracy podcast. This is my first solo podcast. What I'm going to do over the next half an hour or so is I'm going to lay out the issues that are facing children online today and what we can all do to keep kids safe. For the last 6 years, I've traveled all over the United States, speaking to students, teachers, parents, school administrators, law enforcement, mental health groups, educating people about these dangers and their potential solutions. I think I've spoken to more people, certainly more kids, than just about anybody in America. And as part of that, I've heard some really heartbreaking stories. I'm currently running across the country, a marathon each day for 120 days in a row. So I started in San Francisco. I finish on December 20th in Ocean City, Maryland. And I've heard a lot of stories during this run as well as we stop at schools and meet people along the way. So I'm going to share a lot of what I've learned, what I've observed, and again, what we can all do to keep these kids safe. It requires all of us working together, advocates like me, the students themselves, parents, educators, law enforcement, elected officials. It requires all of us being at the same table, having difficult, sometimes uncomfortable conversations about what we can do to keep these kids safe. No one of us can do it on our own. We all need to work together. So my message in schools works well. I think part of the reason for that is, one, I'm a little bit younger than most of the kids' parents and teachers, but I also have a personal story. And that personal story is I was a young person growing up who did everything right, was a good athlete, got good grades, student council, double major, internships. I did everything that they told me growing up you were supposed to do to go out into the real world, to get a good job. That's what I did. I started working in politics in the state of Illinois. Quickly, I moved up the ranks, and then I got fired from a great job working as a personal assistant to the former governor of Illinois. And the reason I got fired from this job is because someone went back through some old social media posts that I'd made as a teenager. I had more than 5,000 posts on my Twitter account. They found 4 or 5 that were, I fully admit, inappropriate. So I got fired from this job on my first day. And I was in the car with the governor when the story broke. It was front page Chicago News. And so it was obviously a very difficult experience, embarrassing, caused a lot of shame for myself and my family. And so I decided to try and turn that experience into something good. And I started going to schools. It started out with college athletic departments and then high schools and middle schools and now elementary schools and parent groups and what have you. And when I first started doing this about 6 years ago, I thought that the worst thing that could happen related to social media was getting fired from a job, getting your picture on the front page of the newspaper. But then I started going into these schools and I started hearing these kids' stories. These kids were literally showing me their iPhones and their Androids, and they're talking about the anxiety that they're feeling and depression. And many of them were they believed at the time that it was a result of what they were exposed to on social media. They were telling me about cyberbullying. They were showing me their phones with online predators contacting middle school and high school kids. And I realized quickly that there was actually much more going on here. Getting fired from a job, getting your picture on the front page of the newspaper was actually far from the worst thing that could happen related to social media. So I've spent, again, the last 6 years traveling all over the country, sharing my story, sharing the story of other young people who have experienced social media harms, and putting forth solutions for the kids, for the schools, for the parents, and also elected officials of what we can do to keep kids safe. Now, I haven't done much social media. I haven't talked to the press much, mainly because I was burnt so badly by those two things as a young person. I was mostly doing live in-person events, but I realized that clearly people value what I have to say because I keep getting speaking engagements, and that these issues are so great that I felt it necessary to do something a little bit more public facing. And so that's why I decided to do this run across America. And so not only am I running across the country, but I'm also speaking at schools and organizations along the way. So I've noticed a few things in my travels, both running and, by plane, train, and automobile as well. And one of the main things that I've noticed that I share with kids and parents is when I look up from my phone and I have real conversations with real people, is that most people in this country are still kind, decent, respectful. They love their neighbor, they love their school, they love their community, and they love our country. And I think that's getting lost a lot with all of us, and especially the kids. And I think part of the reason for that is because so many of us spend so much time on these social media apps consuming the hatefulness, divisiveness, negativity, that it's easy to fall into the trap of thinking that that's reality. And what that really is, based on someone who's experienced both extremes, right, traveling all over the country, but also the worst of one of the worst with social media, it's just been very eye-opening to me. And so I share that with kids and parents as well, and encourage all of us to look up from our phone and have face-to-face conversations, because I think that'll get us a little bit further. So just kind of a reflection to get this started. Beyond my own story, beyond the stories I hear in schools, I've also heard from a lot of parents. Some of these parents have literally lost children because of what they were exposed to on social media. So as I travel and run across the country, I have an RV that travels with me. On the back of this RV, we have 11 names of 11 young people in the states that I run through who have died as a result of cyberbullying, social media choking challenges, counterfeit fentanyl pills that were sold to them on social media, online suicide as a result of online predators and sextortion. So I'll talk about some of those things in the podcast here today. And part of the goal with this is to, those parents of those kids want to get their stories out. So we're doing interviews like this one, but with the actual parents, and we're trying to share these stories as much as we possibly can in hopes of keeping other young people safe. So let's start with some basic facts. First of all, the average teenager spends 4.8 hours each day on social media. That's not total screen time, that's just social media alone. Second fact, according to the FBI, there are more than 500,000 online predators active every single day. Another fact, according to the Colorado Attorney General, it's as easy for a kid today to buy a counterfeit fentanyl pill online as it is to order a pizza or to call an Uber. Another fact, there have been massive increases in youth anxiety, depression, self-harm, eating disorders, and suicide since the advent of the iPhone and social media. As if that wasn't all bad enough, we now also have artificial intelligence. Kids today are able to clone the voices, if they want to, of their classmates, their teachers. They can use AI to create nude images of their classmates, their teachers, or anyone they want to, really. We now have kids who are entering into emotional and romantic relationships with AI chatbots. So this recording is being made on October 25th, 2024. Just this week, we had the story of a young man who took his own life after entering into one of these virtual relationships with an AI chatbot. So those are the facts. Those are the things that we know kids are being exposed to online today. So then the conversation becomes, okay, what can we all do to keep these kids safe? I think one of the main pieces that's missing is the actual education of the kids themselves. You've probably seen a lot of newspaper articles, TV on TV about how bad some of this stuff is for kids. But it's a lot of the adults talking. Very few people are talking to the students themselves. And that's where I've spent most of my time doing literally hundreds and hundreds of speaking engagements all over the country. So I think that's the most important thing, first and foremost, is we must educate these kids about both the promise of the internet, social media, AI, because they are going to be on there, but also these very real present dangers that they will likely be exposed to. So I think that that is the most important part, because these kids are smart. They know all the workarounds. I'll talk about some parental restrictions that could be put in place, some legislative actions that could take place, some policies that schools could put into place. But in almost every case, the kid can get around any restriction that their parents set up. Any monitoring or filtering that's done on a school-owned device, if they want to get around it, they can find a way to do it. They actually do know more about this stuff than the people tasked with keeping them safe. So I think that that is the starting point. We must educate these students. Whether you bring in a speaker like me, whether you have a digital citizenship curriculum, I think that's a good idea. The state of Indiana, for example, mandated digital citizenship online safety education for public school students in the state of Indiana. That was called Mason's Law, which is named after Mason Bogard, who is one of the young people that I'm honoring with my run across the country. So his mother, Joanne, who's a great friend and ally of ours, she pushed that legislation in the state of Indiana. I think that's important for that state and every state across the country. Some of the things that should be talked about are, first and foremost, challenging these kids to be the change themselves, to be the generation that puts a stop to some of these harms. I think it's important to acknowledge to these kids as the adults that we have failed them. We haven't shown them the right way. Many of them have seen athletes, celebrities, politicians, some of them their parents, being unkind, being disrespectful online, sitting at the dinner table on their phone, laying in bed with their phone at night. And as the adults, it's like, why are we shocked that the kids emulate our behavior? So I think it's important to acknowledge that. And I think it's also important as the adults to acknowledge that they are growing up in a world that's very, very different than the world that most of their parents grew up in, the world that their teachers grew up in. And it's just so different. And so I think that's a very important part of this conversation, is acknowledging that, because we know it. They know it, and I think it removes some of the barriers to these conversations. Secondly, we must inform and empower parents. So maybe that's a speaking engagement, maybe that's providing resources through your school. We should give parents action steps that they can take to keep these kids safe. So what are some of those action steps? Well, first and foremost, I believe it's waiting to give kids access to smartphones and social media. A natural question is, okay, well, what is the right age? And I do believe there is some gray area and some nuance, but I would say, as someone who has, again, spoken to hundreds of thousands of kids and parents, wait as long as you possibly can. If you can wait till at least 14 for a smartphone, an iPhone, and 15, I believe, for social media. Some people would even say 16 for social media. And I don't believe that first social media that they get on should be Snapchat or TikTok, because those are two of the most dangerous of the popular ones. And I'll probably talk a little bit more about that as we move forward. And then I would encourage parents to introduce this stuff progressively as opposed to everything at once. So start with a basic piece of technology. A lot of parents think the only option that they have is an iPhone with all the social media. They now have watches. There's a company called Bark that makes a safe starter phone for kids. There are flip phones. There are a bunch of different options for parents that didn't exist when I started doing this 6 years ago. So start them out with something like that. Let them show that they can be responsible. And then maybe it's an iPhone with no social media. And then it's one social media. And again, I don't think that first one should be Snapchat or TikTok. Maybe it's YouTube, maybe it's Instagram. Let them, again, show that they can be responsible before you give them complete access. I believe it's important that there be open communication between kids and parents. What these kids need to hear, in my opinion, from the trusted adults in their lives is that you can come to us with anything, no matter how awkward it is, no matter how uncomfortable it is. I think it's important to acknowledge, yes, you may, as their parent, not know everything about these apps, but you know how to get them the help that they need if they find themselves in a dangerous situation. I think that's what they need to hear from all of the trusted adults in their lives. In addition to that, I think you should keep anything with access to the internet out of your kids' rooms at night. I've had thousands of these stories come to me over the last 6 years. And I ask, the first two questions I ask parents when this stuff comes to me is, what happened? And the second question I ask is, when did this happen? And no matter what the what is, the when is almost always the same. 80% of the time, the when did this happen answer is the same. And that is after the parents have gone to sleep at night. That's when a child is most vulnerable. They're in their room, doors closed, parents are asleep, they have access to everything and everyone on that smartphone or on that social media app. That's when a kid is most likely to fall for an online predator. Kid wants attention, these predators are happy to give it to him. Some of these predators are sophisticated enough to know to contact a kid late at night because that's when they're most vulnerable. That's when these kids are seeing drugs being marketed to them on Snapchat. These drug dealers will literally post their menu of drugs, emojis, acronyms, slang terms that are the different drugs that they're selling. That's when kids access pornography. That's when a lot of the cyberbullying happens, is later at night. Keep anything with access to the internet out of your kids' rooms after the parents have gone to sleep. I would encourage you to limit their social media use. You can do this through an app, a Bark, that makes the Bark phone that I mentioned earlier. They have a parental monitoring software. You can do this through Google Family Link. You can do this through Apple Family Sharing as well. Parents, we need to model appropriate online behavior for these kids as well. So many of them have looked up to their role models who are on their phone all the time, who again are being unkind online. And so just like anything else, they're going to emulate the behavior of the trusted adults in their role models. And so I think we all need to be mindful about how we ourselves are interacting with this technology. I think it's also important that as the adults, we recognize that these kids will make mistakes. They're going to say and do stupid shit just like all of us did. They don't become adults because we give them an adult tool. I've said this before and I'll say it again. An adult, a smartphone, social media, that is an adult tool in the hands, in the hearts, and in the minds of a child. They're kids. They're curious. Of course, if you put an inappropriate video in front of them, of course they're going to watch it. They're going to push boundaries just like all of us did. They're going to make mistakes. And of course, they have to pay for their words and their actions. But they also need grace. They need forgiveness. They need the ability to move beyond their mistakes. They need us, the adults, to recognize that, again, they're growing up in a very different world than we did. And gone are the days of getting called in the principal's office and just being able to deny what you said. Today, there's a screenshot, there's a recording, and those things could be saved forever. We've all said and done things that we're not proud of. You know, I do these parent presentations, and these parents will come up to me and they'll say afterwards, you know, thank God there was no social media when I was a teenager. I wouldn't be a principal, I wouldn't be a teacher, I wouldn't have the job that I have. But there is social media today. And so I think it's important that we acknowledge that and we give these kids ability to make a mistake and move beyond it. And so I think that's very, very important. If my word's not good enough for you, I just want to share a story with you about the way that the people who actually make these apps, the way that they parent their kids around it. So last year I was doing a speaking engagement in Silicon Valley in California. And before I went out there, I got a phone call from the school principal. And she told me good news and bad news. Good news is we have 300 parents signed up for your talk tomorrow night. The bad news is many of them work for these social media companies that you're going to be talking about. So I had a decision to make. How do I give that talk, right? Do I come in with a little softer message than what I normally get? Do I not mention specific apps because of the audience? But then I thought, no, this is important. I know that this stuff is happening on all of these apps because I've heard these stories for 5 years at that point. And so I decided to go in and give the same talk that I always give, but I gave it even a little bit more passionately than what I normally would. And when I got done, there were at least 50 parents who lined up, who shook my hand, said, Ben, thank you so much for what you're doing. Everything you're saying is right, is true. There needs to be 1,000 more people out there doing what you're doing. These are the people who work for these companies. And then they said, oh, and also, I send my kid to this private school because they don't allow the kids to have their cell phones during the school day. So if my word as someone who's traveled all over and heard thousands of these stories, if that is not good enough for you, that's what the people who work for these companies say. They don't allow their kids to have it. They certainly don't let them have it in their rooms at night. They limit how much time they're spending on there, and they send them to schools where they can't have smartphones and social media. So let's talk about what schools can do. I believe it's prudent for schools to limit the kids' access to phones during the school day. Now, this looks a little bit different for every school, but I believe the best practice is bell to bell, no phones. Anytime they are in from 8 a.m. to 3 p.m., they do not have access to their phones. Now, some schools aren't willing to do that. Maybe it's a yonder pouch or that just take the kids' phones away. But I do believe that schools should limit the kids' ability to use their phones during the school day. Obviously, schools should be blocking certain types of content, filtering it on their school-owned devices and networks. Every school in America needs an AI policy and a social media policy. Schools should implement digital safety, curriculum, online safety. These are topics that need to be discussed early and often. Elected officials also have a role to play in keeping kids safe online. I don't believe, as some people in this space do, I don't believe that we can legislate or regulate our way out of these problems. This is part of the solution. It's not all of the solution. Same thing with the parental restrictions and controls. For any piece of legislation that's passed, the kids can probably find a way around that. Now, that doesn't mean that legislation shouldn't be passed. And so the Kids Online Safety Act at the federal level is a good piece of legislation. It passed the United States Senate 91-3, completely bipartisan support. It moved over to the House of Representatives, passed out of committee, and is now waiting to be called for a floor vote in U.S. Congress. The issue is it's not being, and it's being held up by House Speaker Mike Johnson and by Steve Scalise. Scalise has taken nearly $200,000 from the big tech companies in campaign contributions. Big tech has spent more than $50 million this year alone lobbying members of Congress. One lobbyist for every 5 members. Our friend Nikki Reesberg on her Scrolling to Death podcast earlier this week said that these companies spend $225,000 per day that Congress is in session to lobby those members of Congress. So as far as I can tell, that's why action isn't, that's why the Kids Online Safety Act is not moving forward at the congressional level. And President Biden has said that he would sign that piece of legislation if it made it to his desk. There is some action at the state level, both Democrats and Republicans. And so 2 of the leading governors, I would say, on these issues of youth online safety are Gavin Newsom of California, who's one of the most liberal Democrats governors in America, and Spencer Cox of Utah, who is a Republican. And so this shouldn't be a red thing or blue thing, Republican, Democrat, liberal, conservative. It's about keeping kids safe. No matter what state you're in, it shouldn't matter. The politics shouldn't matter. There's an understanding with everyone that this stuff is bad. Almost everyone gets that at this point. So then it becomes, what do we do about that? And so I would encourage states to introduce several different types. There's a bunch of stuff out there. One that we support big time is called Sammy's Law, which would require companies to open their platform to third-party parental monitoring software, like I mentioned with Bark. So that's one that we like. There are a bunch of things that can be done. And so what happens, just so everyone knows, is anytime a state introduces this type of legislation, these companies send in their lobbyists to try and kill it. If they happen to pass the legislation, these companies then, through their trade organization called Net Choice, they sue these states saying that their legislation is unlawful. So no matter what the legislation is, they will lobby against it and they will file a lawsuit. It's happened almost everywhere they've passed legislation. So I believe states should introduce this stuff, should pass this stuff, and let these companies, this Net Choice, their lobbies, let them fight this battle in Congress, but also in every state legislature across the country. If all 50 states are introducing multiple pieces of legislation in every session, I think it's going to be a lot more difficult to fight it with the same vigor that they have the previous legislation, right? If only 2 states are introducing it, it makes it very easy. Okay, we just go into these 2 states, we fight it, we bring in our lobbyists and lawyers. But if every state is doing that, I think eventually these companies will come to the table and they'll either take action themselves or they just simply won't be able to fight every single piece of legislation that passes. So this is a fight that should be waged on a whole lot of different fronts. And I think that's a strategy moving forward. I think the advocacy organizations, and some people won't like what I'm about to say, but the truth is some of these advocacy organizations in the online safety space are funded by the tech companies. Okay, the most well-known one, I'm not going to mention their name, but a very well-known nonprofit is funded by the Zuckerberg Foundation, the Bezos Foundation, Gates, and pardon me if I'm butchering the name of their actual organization, but Mark Zuckerberg, Jeff Bezos, and Bill Gates, that's who's funding their organization. So these companies are not negotiating in good faith with elected officials. And it does rub me the wrong way when we are the advocates, the people that are supposed to be keeping the kids safe, are taking money from those very companies. And so I don't put a lot of stock in what organizations like the one I just mentioned, what they have to say. And I don't, these companies will hire people in our space, other speakers, frankly, influencers in the online safety space. They'll pay those people to go to their events where they roll out these parental controls that don't actually work. They'll say, Instagram has done this, TikTok has done this, I believe Snapchat has done this. And so they get a lot of good publicity about that. The problem is what they're saying they're doing is either completely ineffective or only marginally helpful. And so we need to, it's just hard to say we're fighting against this stuff when you're taking money from them. And so I've never taken a dime from a social media company, nor will I. And so I think that's important. We need to continue researching this stuff. Jonathan Haidt's book, The Anxious Generation, is phenomenal. It validates a lot of what I've heard anecdotally over the last 6 years. And so I think beyond the research, the advocacy, being mindful about the advocacy groups, and I'm not saying just because they've taken money from these companies that they're necessarily bad, but we should be mindful about we should just pay attention to the things that they're pushing, because it just seems that if you're taking, they spend money on lobbyists and lawyers and also on these advocacy groups. Are these groups on the side of kids and parents, or are they on the side of Zuckerberg, Bezos, and Bill Gates? I think that's a reasonable question to ask. I think there needs to be an organization that's created, or an organization that already exists, that ranks elected officials on the way that they vote on youth online safety legislation. Do you or don't you take action to keep kids safe? Planned Parenthood does this. The NRA does this. National Federation of Independent Business does this, a whole bunch of different special interests, different organizations. They rank elected officials. You get an A if you support our agenda, you get an F if you don't. That should be happening within the online safety space. I worked in politics. I worked on campaigns. I worked for a governor very, very briefly for one day. But I know that elected officials only act if money moves for or against them, or if media moves for or against them. And so we know that that's the way to convince these parents, because again, we have 11 names on the back of our bus. Mike Johnson won't meet with those parents of those kids who've died as a result of what they've been exposed to on social media. And I just believe if there was a way to reward the elected officials, whether it's reward and punish for the actions they take based on keeping kids safe online, that they would be a little bit more inclined to take some of these steps. So I think that if that organization, a nonprofit would take that up, some sort of a ranking of elected officials at both the federal and state level, I think that would be very, very valuable in the effort to keep kids safe. So for the last 30 minutes or so, you've heard me outline some of these dangers that kids are facing today, some potential solutions, my call for all of us to work together. And so now is the time for action. We can't wait any longer. How many more kids have to die before we all decide to do more to keep them safe? How many more names do we have to put on the back of an RV and run across the country to help educate people about this stuff? The time for action is now. So if you're a parent, talk to your kids today. It's a reasonable question to ask your kid's school, what is your social media policy? What is your AI policy? When are the kids allowed to have phones during the school day, and why? What happens in our school if somebody makes a threat of violence? How do you handle that as a school? Those are all fair questions to ask. Call your elected officials, especially right now, immediately. Call your member of Congress and ask them to support the Kids Online Safety Act. That's in Congress right now. It's, again, October 25th, 2024. Call your state representative and state senator. Ask them what they're doing. If they aren't doing anything, reach out to myself, Safe Social Network, other individuals and organizations that are in this space, and ask them what is some potential legislation that could be introduced that could help keep our kids safe. Those are all fair questions to ask, but start with your own kids. You can have that conversation immediately. Make sure, again, that they know that they can come talk to you about anything that happens online, no matter how awkward it is or how uncomfortable it is, that they're not going to be in trouble, that they can come to you and have an open and honest conversation about anything that happens online. So thank you all for listening to the Ben Tracy podcast.
Thank you all for listening. Thanks again to Bark Technologies for sponsoring this podcast. We'll see you all on the next episode.